Welcome to the production part of this course. So in this part, we're going to talk about how are our clothes actually made and how can we start to do that from, the linear way we've talked about already in the course and move it to a more circular way. Now that's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take time. But I want to tell you some examples of some ways that start to move us in a slightly more circular direction when we're making our products. Now quite often you maybe hear of a circular product or a brand talking about this, but really we actually think much more than just a material or a product when we think about the production. Let's look at circularity from the point of the overall factory that's making it. Now, we know that it's multiple factories, but let's look at it from one particular one. Now, yes, the product, we want to make it as circular as possible, but what about the water that's used to make that product? How can we think about that water and make it circular? So instead of using a high volume of water and it maybe goes into a river, we really hope not, but hopefully that factory has on-site water treatment, and ideally they're actually able to clean it as much as possible so that water can be used again and again and again, so that they barely have to use any fresh water and barely any water goes out. So we can think about circularity from an overall manufacturing side as well. But we can go one step further. We can think about the heat that's maybe used in some processes within the factory, but that heat, instead of going out into the atmosphere, could actually be captured and it could go into another part of the factory to use in drying. So we're circulating that heat better, more energy efficient. Or the emissions that are maybe coming off the factory. How could we capture those with certain filters? And there's one really cool one called Air Ink that captures those pollutions and it's actually turning it into a carbon-based ink, which we can then use to dye our clothes. So there's lots of many elements of circularity, even in the supply chain, before we get to retail. But some of the key things when we think about circularity is we want to ensure that the things that are going round and round and round the world are as clean as possible, and we avoid any of these toxic chemicals. One, because if you have to work with them day in, day out, it's not going to be good for that person's health. No matter how much health and safety is in place, we want to cut those out as much as possible for the people in the supply chain that are having to work there. But then also, we don't want these harmful chemicals on our skin for a long, long period. And when we're washing them, they're going out into the rivers. So what's the impact that has? And then ultimately, when these clothes maybe end up in the global south, as they are today, what happens when these clothes are there in the landfill for long, long periods, or they're even set on fire and burnt? What does that mean for a kid having to go to school and breathe in those fumes each day? It's a really toxic place. So we always want to start when we're designing products with the cleanest products we can and avoid those harmful toxic chemicals. So that touched on a little bit the social, the ethical side of it. But in this next part of the production phase, I want to talk about how we can design in a way that reduces the amount of materials we use overall. So if you all imagine maybe when you've made cookies or done some baking at home, when you make those cookies with a little circular cookie cutter, you cut them out and you've got some waste. Well, it's actually exactly the same when you're making a t-shirt. You cut out the t-shirt shape from a large piece of fabric and you're going to have cutting waste. Now when you make the cookies, you can squeeze it all together and you can make the same. Not quite the same for t-shirts. And actually, in fact, you can have up to 30% cutting waste in the production phase. So it's a lot of fabric. You go into a store, you buy a t-shirt today, you might think that's all the fabric that was there and there's no fabric waste in the supply chain, but there is, and there's a lot of it. So we need to think about how can we design products in a way so they're really high pattern efficiency, as in for that huge big roll of material, how can we ensure that as close to 100% of that is used up? And we can think of very classical things like the kimono, which is a large big piece of rectangle fabric that can be wrapped around in very different ways. And there's other examples of that as well. So we really want to think about that. And that's a way that we can reduce the supply chain waste. But we can also think about it differently. Traditionally, if you look at the shoes you might be wearing right now, we then have this huge big wedge of material on the bottom of our shoes. But why do we have that? Do we need that huge big wedge of material? Well, if we think about these future ways of producing products, could we use 3D printing? So one example could be like this one right here, is instead of having this huge big wedge of material, actually when you think about footwear, you need it for support and you need it in specific areas. So how can we use less material by using 3D printing so we only have that reinforcement support where we absolutely need it, and therefore we use less resources overall? Albeit that's not circular, but it means we're reducing the demand on virgin resources. And some other ways, if we keep producing products and hope that they sell, then we're always going to be in this capitalist model of make more, make more, make more, hope it sells, hope it sells. And it's almost that race to the bottom. So how can we pivot that to more of a production model whereby we only make what people will actually buy? Now, that's maybe something that we can go back to the old days and think that was quite normal, that you would go to your local atelier who would make a dress for you or whatever it might be. But we need to go back to that as well, to move away from this overproduction and overconsumption. Now, that ensures that you've not got huge inventory. Every product is only made when there's a customer, so you don't need to go into heavy sales and discounting. So that's a much more efficient use of resources. And one of the ones that I really, really like is one called King Children. So this is the sunglasses they make and the glasses that I'm wearing, or maybe yourself at home. We've got 8 billion different shapes and sizes of faces, but the glasses and eyewear industry largely make the same size of glasses for everyone. So what they do is you actually use an app, your iPhone, it measures your face, and with that scanning, it creates a product bespoke to your face only. Now, when we go back to the concepts around design for longevity, design for purpose, if that product fits me perfectly, then I'm much more likely to keep it for a lot longer. And again, that plays into this whole idea of reconnecting with the products we have because they fit better, or they can be customized in a way. And again, these, just like the product before, have been 3D printed, so you don't have the same volume of waste you have when you do traditional production. This is a way that we see it happening more and more, and we also see the onshoring of manufacturing as well. So production being made, entirely in certain countries and sold entirely in that country as well. We will see this more and more as we look at reducing those timescales and also reducing those emissions from the field all the way through to the end customer. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea of just a couple of different examples of how the production phase, we can minimize the resource use by producing with lower material use and actually moving into this more disruptive model of 3D printing and made to order.